It was a warm August night in Seattle, 1990. 24-year-old Andrea Randy Levine had no idea that her life was about to intersect with a man the media would later call the charmer. She was vibrant, hopeful, and full of life. But within hours, she would become the final victim of one of Washington's most disturbing serial killers. This is the story of how Andrea's world was stolen and how her death finally unmasked a predator hiding in plain sight. It was a warm August night in Seattle, 1990. The air carried the faint hum of traffic, the glow of neon signs bouncing off damp sidewalks, and the sense of a city alive with possibility. For 24-year-old Andrea Randy Levine, it was just another night in the city she loved. She had a future stretching out before her, a network of friends who adored her, and a family that believed she was destined for something meaningful. But by the time that night ended, Andrea's life would be brutally stolen, and the name of her killer would forever stain the memory of that summer. This is her story, and it begins not with horror, but with the bright light of who she was. Andrea Levine wasn't just another name on a list of victims. She was a young woman full of energy, known for her wit, her kindness, and her independence. Friends described her as someone who could walk into a room and make people feel instantly at ease. She had that rare ability to connect, to listen, and to bring warmth wherever she went. Her nickname Randy stuck with her because it matched her spirit, casual, approachable, and vibrant. She lived in Seattle, a city that in the late 1980s and early 1990s was bustling with change. Music scenes were shifting, young professionals were chasing careers, and neighborhoods were alive with people searching for connection. For Andrea, Seattle wasn't just a place to live, it was a place to build her life. She had friends, routines, and dreams that extended far beyond the ordinary. But like so many young women in that era, Andrea also lived in a time when predators moved in the shadows, and one of those predators was closer than anyone realized. George Waterfield Russell Jr., later nicknamed the Charmer, had been circulating through Seattle and nearby Bellevue for years. On the surface, he was smooth-talking, well-dressed, and socially confident. He blended in with ease, the type of man who could approach a woman in a bar or a social setting and instantly disarm her with charm. But beneath that polished exterior lay something dark, something twisted. Andrea didn't know it then, but she was about to cross paths with him. On the last night of August in 1990, Andrea spent her evening much like countless other 20-somethings in Seattle. She enjoyed time with friends, relaxed, and unwound from the pressures of daily life. She had no reason to suspect that danger was lurking nearby. Unlike many crime stories where victims take calculated risks, Andrea's choices were normal, everyday decisions. That's what makes her story so devastating. She wasn't reckless, she was simply living her life. Sometime during that night, Russell zeroed in on her. The details of their initial interaction remain murky, but what's clear is that his pattern was consistent. He preyed on women who trusted easily, who were kind, who were social, women like Andrea. He knew how to talk, how to flatter, and how to disarm his targets. He made them feel like they were safe in his company. By the time Andrea realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Russell had a way of moving quickly from charming to dangerous. Investigators later pieced together the events of that night, but the grim reality is that Andrea fell victim to his manipulation, his control, and ultimately his violence. Her body was discovered in her own apartment in Seattle, but what shocked police wasn't just that she had been killed, it was how she was found. Russell, like in his previous murders, had staged Andrea's body in a grotesque and degrading manner. To him, the murder wasn't enough. He wanted to humiliate, to leave a mark, to create a scene that would horrify whoever discovered it. And it did. The officers who arrived at Andrea's apartment were met with a crime scene that felt both personal and theatrical. The staging of her body made it clear that the killer wasn't just lashing out, he was performing. He wanted attention, he wanted his cruelty to be remembered. For investigators, it was a chilling sign that this wasn't an isolated incident. They were dealing with someone calculated, someone who had likely done this before. Andrea's murder shook those who knew her. Friends and family were devastated, grappling not just with the loss but with the brutality of how her life had been taken. She wasn't just gone, she had been reduced to a prop in someone else's twisted fantasy. And for Seattle, her death marked the escalation of a nightmare that had been quietly unfolding. Because Andrea wasn't the first. Before her, two other women, Mary Ann Polreich and Carol Beather, had been murdered in nearby Bellevue, their bodies also staged in bizarre positions. At the time, investigators were struggling to connect the dots. The cases seemed horrific, but not obviously linked. Andrea's death changed that. The similarities were undeniable. The killer had a pattern, the killer was still out there, and the killer was escalating. Andrea's life should have continued, filled with dreams and milestones that every 24-year-old deserves. Instead, her name would become synonymous with a case that exposed one of Washington State's most chilling serial killers. The tragedy of her story isn't just that she died, it's that she died because someone like George Russell was allowed to move freely, undetected, hiding behind charm and confidence, while masking a darkness no one saw coming. For the community, Andrea's murder was a wake-up call. It wasn't just another crime in the city, it was a statement that someone dangerous was walking among them, someone who could turn a normal night into a scene of horror. And as investigators dug deeper, they realized that Andrea's case might be the key, the crime that would finally unlock the truth about the so-called charmer. In the next chapter, we'll walk through the haunting details of that night, how Russell gained Andrea's trust, what happened in those final hours, and how her staged body became the critical turning point in a string of murders that had left detectives chasing shadows. Because while Andrea Randy Levine's life ended that night, her story did not. Her murder became the crime that revealed a predator, and in death, Andrea would become the voice that finally brought him down.
On the night of August 31st, 1990, Andrea Randy Levine's world intersected with that of George Russell Jr., a man whose polished charm masked one of the darkest minds in Washington State's history. Andrea was only 24 years old, young enough to still be building her future, but old enough to know who she was and what she wanted. Her friends described her as kind, fun-loving, and independent. What no one could have imagined was that her natural trust and openness would be turned against her in the most horrific way. George Russell was a predator who thrived on nightlife. He lingered around bars, lounges, and social circles where women felt safe enough to let their guard down. He wasn't the stereotypical figure of fear. He was well-dressed, quick-witted, and knew exactly what to say to make people feel comfortable. That night, he focused his attention on Andrea. We may never know exactly what words he used or what impression he gave, but his pattern was always the same: disarm with charm, then isolate his target. Andrea let him into her orbit, perhaps thinking he was just another friendly face in Seattle's vibrant social scene. To her, he may have seemed harmless. To him, she was the next victim in a carefully constructed fantasy of control and degradation. Hours later, Andrea's life would be violently taken. Investigators believe Russell attacked her in her apartment, catching her off guard, overwhelming her before she had any chance of escape. His crimes were not only about killing, they were about domination. Once Andrea was dead, the horror deepened. Like with his previous victims, Russell staged her body in a grotesque tableau. Detectives who arrived at the scene were struck by the deliberate cruelty of it. Andrea's body wasn't just left where she fell. Instead, it had been positioned in a way that stripped her of dignity and turned the crime scene into a stage. Russell placed objects around her, items meant to shock and humiliate. It was his twisted signature, a final act of control over the women he murdered. One detective later described walking into Andrea's apartment as stepping into a scene designed to send a message. Nothing about it felt spontaneous. Everything pointed to a killer who wanted to be remembered, someone who wanted his victims to be discovered in ways that would horrify the living. The discovery sent ripples of fear and anger through Seattle. This wasn't just another murder, it was the third in a string of similarly staged killings. First, Marianne Polreich in June 1990, then Carol Beather in August, and now Andrea Levine. Each woman had been brutally murdered and left in positions that defied any normal act of violence. This was ritualistic, this was calculated, but Andrea's case carried something different. While the first two murders left detectives frustrated, Andrea's apartment held more clues. Among her belongings, investigators noticed something was missing, a distinctive amethyst ring she often wore. Days later, that very ring turned up in a pawn shop. The name on the receipt? George Waterfield Russell Jr. That discovery was a turning point. Suddenly, investigators had more than just a series of similar murders. They had a connection, a name, and a trail. Andrea's death, as horrific as it was, provided the evidence police needed to finally close in on the man responsible. The crime scene itself became a blueprint of Russell's depravity. Detectives photographed every angle, every item placed around Andrea's body, trying to understand his mindset.
Why the staging? Why the humiliation? Forensic psychologists later suggested that Russell wasn't just killing for control, he was killing for recognition. By posing his victims, he was creating scenes that would etch themselves into the memories of anyone who saw them. It was his way of leaving behind a calling card. Friends and family of Andrea struggled to process the news. Losing a loved one is devastating enough, but learning that her final moments had been turned into something so cruel made the grief unbearable. For her friends, Andrea wasn't a victim, she was Randy, the person who laughed with them, supported them, and shared her dreams. The staged crime scene clashed violently with who she truly was, making the loss all the more painful. In the days that followed, news of Andrea's murder spread quickly across Seattle. People who had once dismissed the earlier killings as isolated incidents began to realize something darker was happening. Women were being targeted, and the killer was still walking free. The idea that someone could charm his way into women's lives and then reduce them to objects of horror shook the city to its core. Andrea's murder was the breaking point. Law enforcement knew they couldn't let this pattern continue. Investigators pulled together every lead, every connection, and began focusing their attention squarely on Russell. They learned that he had a reputation, a man who drifted from social group to social group, always inserting himself into conversations, always looking for opportunities. Many remembered him as charismatic but unsettling, the kind of man who smiled with his mouth but not his eyes. As the investigation picked up speed, detectives realized just how close Russell had been all along. He wasn't a shadowy figure hiding in alleys. He was at the bars, at the clubs, mingling in plain sight. He was the man women remembered chatting with briefly before moving on with their night. He was the person friends vaguely recognized but couldn't place. Andrea's life was cut short that August night, but her death became the catalyst for justice. Without the clues left behind in her apartment, without the missing ring that linked Russell directly to her, the case might have dragged on. Instead, Andrea's murder pulled back the curtain on the so-called charmer. Her story is one of tragedy, but also of revelation. She didn't choose to be a victim, but her case became the one that exposed a predator. Her final chapter gave investigators the evidence they needed to bring George Russell out of the nightlife shadows and into the harsh light of justice. Now that you know the tragic story of Andrea Randy Levine, let's dive into the dark story of the killer himself.
George Waterfield Russell Jr. wasn't born a headline, a criminal, or a figure of horror. On the surface, he seemed like an ordinary man, charming, confident, and socially adept. But beneath the polished exterior lurked a predator who knew how to blend in, to manipulate, and to strike without warning. Those who encountered him often described him as charismatic, even likable, someone who could make you laugh one moment and leave you uneasy the next. That duality was exactly what made him dangerous. Russell had a pattern. He hunted women who were trusting, outgoing, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. He understood human behavior better than most people understood themselves. He could sense vulnerability, exploit kindness, and create opportunities for control without ever raising suspicion. This was not the chaotic violence of someone out of control. This was meticulous, deliberate, and calculated. His known killing spree began in 1989, long before Andrea Levine became his final victim. The first woman to fall prey was Mary Ann Polreich, found murdered in Bellevue, Washington. Like Andrea, Mary Ann was an ordinary young woman, going about her life when she crossed paths with Russell. He overpowered her, and then, in a signature act of cruelty, staged her body in a disturbing tableau. Investigators who arrived at the scene were horrified not only by the violence, but by the meticulous way the crime had been orchestrated. Each pose, each placement of objects, carried a message of dominance and control. A few months later, in August 1990, Russell killed Carol Beatty, again in Bellevue. The same pattern emerged: charm, control, and ultimately, death. Carol's body was left in a manner meant to shock whoever discovered it, sending a clear signal of the killer's audacity. Law enforcement began to suspect a serial offender, someone methodical and cunning, but there was little to go on. Russell was careful, leaving minimal evidence behind. He existed in plain sight, smiling and blending in while his crimes went unnoticed. It's impossible to overstate the darkness of his personality. Friends and acquaintances would later recall the duality of his life, the man they laughed with at parties and the man capable of unspeakable acts in private. Russell's charm was a weapon.
He could earn trust within minutes, weaving himself into social circles with ease. That trust became the gateway to manipulation, isolation, and ultimately, murder. He wasn't motivated by impulse or rage. There was a cold calculation to every act. Police and forensic psychologists described him as someone who needed to assert dominance, to stage control over life and death. The posing of his victims' bodies was more than grotesque. It was ritualistic. He wanted each murder to leave an imprint, to force the world to witness his cruelty indirectly. It was a signature of the man's warped psyche. The killing of Andrea Levine, however, was the turning point. Unlike his previous victims, her death left a trail that couldn't be ignored. The distinctive amethyst ring she always wore, taken by Russell and later found in a pawn shop, linked him directly to her. For the first time, investigators had a tangible thread that could unravel his carefully constructed web of deception. Russell's life outside of murder appeared normal, almost enviable. He had friends, moved in social circles, and maintained a facade of decency. Yet every interaction, every conversation carried potential danger for someone unsuspecting. His outward charm masked a sociopath capable of methodical, deliberate cruelty. The duality of his life made him terrifying, and that is exactly what horrified the community once his crimes were revealed. His capture was inevitable, but not before he had left a trail of broken lives. 3 women, all vibrant, all trusting, all manipulated by his false persona, were gone. Each of their deaths was a message, a testament to Russell's control and his complete lack of empathy. He didn't see them as people, he saw them as instruments, objects to be controlled and displayed. When the police finally arrested Russell in September 1990, the community reacted with shock and revulsion. The man they thought they knew, the charming acquaintance, the smiling stranger, was unmasked as a monster. The images of his victims, the staging of their deaths, and the details of his manipulation created outrage. People could hardly reconcile the man who had charmed neighbors and friends with the ruthless killer he truly was. In court, Russell's demeanor remained unnervingly calm. He showed no remorse, and his words, when recorded, were chilling in their detachment. Observers described him as eerily composed, almost proud of the cunning he had displayed. To the families and the public, his behavior deepened the sense of disgust and betrayal. This wasn't a man who had lost control. This was a man in complete command of a life built around deception, cruelty, and death. George Waterfield Russell Jr. stands as a terrifying example of a predator hiding in plain sight. His murders were deliberate, his charm a weapon, and his disregard for human life absolute. He manipulated trust, weaponized social interaction, and turned ordinary spaces into stages of horror. The life he stole from Andrea Levine and the other victims left scars not only on their families, but on the entire Seattle community. As we move to the final chapter, we will explore how investigators pieced together the evidence that brought Russell to justice. We'll see how Andrea Levine's murder, which should have been just another tragedy, became the key to unraveling the twisted life of one of Washington's most disturbing serial killers. And we'll examine the aftermath, the trial, the sentence, and the shockwaves that rippled through the city as the truth came to light.
The streets of Seattle were buzzing with tension in early September 1990. After Andrea Levine's murder, the city had been on high alert. Women were warned, friends were anxious, and the police department was under immense pressure. The case had already claimed the lives of 2 other women, Mary Ann Polreich and Carol Beather, and now Andrea had fallen victim to the same predator. Seattle was desperate for answers, and the hunt for George Waterfield Russell Jr. had become urgent. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Investigators had been meticulously combing through evidence from Andrea's apartment. Every detail mattered. Then a clue emerged that would become the thread leading straight to the man responsible. Andrea's distinctive amethyst ring, taken by Russell, was found in a local pawn shop. The receipt listed George Russell's name. Just like that, a name became a target. Police quickly built a profile. Russell wasn't hiding in the shadows. He moved through the city with confidence, blending into bars, social events, and casual conversations. His charisma had protected him for years, allowing him to charm his way past suspicion. But now the net was closing. Every previous murder, every stage scene, every piece of evidence, it all pointed to him, and the authorities were ready to act. When detectives approached Russell's apartment, tension gripped the team. They knew they were about to confront a man who had killed 3 women, one of them in a horrifyingly calculated manner. The air was thick with anticipation. The arrest, when it happened, was explosive. Russell's charm evaporated the moment he realized he had been caught. He didn't fight violently, but the moment of capture was dramatic. Officers swarmed his apartment, slamming the door open, guns drawn, shouting commands. Russell froze, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. He had been the predator for so long, always in control, always one step ahead, and suddenly he was powerless. The contrast was striking. The man who had so easily manipulated and dominated others was now the one at the mercy of law enforcement. The community reaction was immediate. News crews descended on Seattle, neighbors whispered in disbelief, and the families of his victims could barely process the reality. The man they had unknowingly crossed paths with, the friendly face at a bar, the neighbor with a smile, was a cold-blooded killer. People were horrified, angry, and relieved all at once. Finally, justice was within reach. Russell's trial was a spectacle. Courtrooms were packed, media coverage was intense, and the public could not get enough of the story. Prosecutors presented chilling evidence, the staged scenes of his victims, witness testimonies, and the amethyst ring that linked him directly to Andrea Levine. Psychologists testified about his manipulative, sociopathic tendencies, describing a man who could smile while plotting murder. Throughout the trial, Russell's demeanor remained unnervingly calm. He showed little remorse, and his detachment made him even more repulsive to the jury and the public. His charm, once a tool to manipulate women, now made him appear cold and calculating in the courtroom. It was clear that the same traits that allowed him to commit these heinous crimes without suspicion were the traits that made him one of the most unsettling figures in Washington state history. The verdict was swift and decisive. Russell was found guilty on multiple counts of murder. The families of his victims felt a measure of relief, though the pain of loss remained. Seattle could finally begin to heal, knowing that a predator who had hidden in plain sight was behind bars. Yet the shockwaves didn't end there. The community could not stop talking about him. How could someone so seemingly normal commit acts so depraved? How had he gone unnoticed for so long? These questions lingered, leaving residents anxious but also determined to be vigilant. The case became a reminder that evil can sometimes wear a friendly face. For Andrea Levine, the truth of her death became the key to justice. Her story, though tragic, ensured that George Russell could no longer harm anyone else. Her courage, though posthumous, forced the exposure of a man who had relied on charm and deception to cover his crimes. Even years later, her story resonates. People still recall the horror of the staged crime scenes, the audacity of the killer, and the dramatic moment of his arrest. It serves as a chilling lesson. Predators often hide in plain sight, and it sometimes takes tragedy to bring them down. So now we ask you, after hearing the story of Andrea Levine and the chilling crimes of George Waterfield Russell Jr., what do you think? Could someone like this ever truly be spotted before it's too late? Did the arrest feel satisfying, or does the horror of his crimes linger too deeply? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is part of remembering Andrea and keeping her story alive. The arrest of George Russell was dramatic, shocking, and necessary. But the true legacy of this case is twofold: the reminder that evil can lurk behind charm, and the courage of a victim whose story helped stop a killer. Andrea Levine's life was cut tragically short, but her story became the key to ending a reign of terror in Seattle. As the city moves forward, the memory of her smile, her laughter, and her life lost is preserved not just in police reports or news articles, but in the awareness of a community that refuses to forget. Justice may have been served in a courtroom, but her story will forever remind us of the importance of vigilance, courage, and compassion in the face of darkness.